Mr. President, I wanted to rise this afternoon to address the budget standoff that we're in and the looming debt ceiling issue that we're facing. I just want to address this briefly. There'll be more to say about this in the near future, but the administration tells us that November 3rd is the date after which the extraordinary measures they've been taking run out, and they say that on that date they need to start borrowing more money. As we know, we have a temporary legislation that funds the government through December 11th, I think it is, after which we have not yet resolved how we keep the government operating. And I want to just address this a little bit. First of all, the fundamental problem we have here on the debt ceiling increase is we're spending too much money, we're running annual deficits, and we have to borrow money to make up the shortfall. That's what's happening. That's why we reach the debt ceiling. That's why we get there and the administration wants to borrow more. But what's particularly problematic is the president's position that we ought to increase the debt ceiling, allow him to borrow a lot more money without even so much as having a discussion, much less actually addressing the gross fiscal mismanagement that's requiring us to borrow all this money in the first place. Let's go back to a recent occasion on which we had this debate. 2011, we reached a debt limit and had a big debate about how we should proceed. And what happened was Congress insisted, and the president resisted but eventually agreed, to some very modest spending cuts. They established caps, limits on discretionary spending. That's the 37-38% of all federal spending that Congress controls through the annual appropriation process. So some caps were put in place, and the idea was for every dollar that we'd raise the debt ceiling, every new dollar of debt we would impose on the American people, we'd at least cut a dollar of spending over the next 10 years so that as we were making a bad situation, our debt load, a bad situation worse by increasing the debt, we'd at least be improving the underlying dynamic, diminishing the total spending, so in the future our deficits would be smaller. That was the idea. And if you take a look, it actually caused a lot of progress on this category of federal spending, the discretionary spending. If you look at a graph we have here that shows the increase in federal spending, this red line shows a huge surge that happened when the president insisted on that massive stimulus spending bill. So that's the big spike. It dropped off a little bit because that single individual gargantuan bill wasn't replicated the next year. And then, short time thereafter, we reached this agreement with the president where Congress said, Mr. President, you get the debt ceiling increase, but in return for that, let's put a cap on the amount. In fact, let's reduce the amount gradually over time that we're going to spend on discretionary spending, and then we'll allow it to grow at the rate of inflation after a certain number of years. That was the nature of the agreement. The idea being address the underlying problem of overspending that's requiring all of this debt. So, as you can see, Mr. President, this black line shows where we are today. We made some progress. There's a gradual, modest decline. This is the big surge that came from that gigantic stimulus bill, but after that, a gradual, steady, modest decline so that on this category of spending, discretionary spending, like I said, almost 40% of the federal budget, we actually limited that. It's the first time that I'm aware of in years, maybe many decades, that we've had several consecutive years in which the federal government has actually spent less each year than the year before in discretionary spending. Now, by way of full disclosure, I voted against this overall agreement because I knew then, as I know now, that while this makes some progress, it doesn't solve the underlying problem. It moves in the right direction, you can argue, but it does not fix the huge debt problem that we have. So this chart illustrates this. It shows that in recent years, we've had a slight decline in the size of our deficits. If we went back further, we'd see the deficits were even higher earlier. We've made some progress. The annual deficits, that's the red line corresponding to each year since 2014. You can see this has come down a little bit. This year, the deficit will be about $426 billion. Way too high, still too big a number, but less than it was in recent years. But here's the problem, Mr. President. There's people around this town talk as though we've got this problem solved. Since the deficits, a few years ago were $1 trillion, today it's $426 billion, so isn't everything okay? Take a look at where this line is going. This isn't okay. This isn't 100 years from now. This is 5 years from now. This is 10 years from now. What's happening is our deficits are going to explode. And this isn't just my projection. This is the Congressional Budget Office, nonpartisan CBO. And by the way, their numbers are wildly optimistic. I just give you 3 examples of assumptions that they make, and you can judge whether you think these are reasonable assumptions or not. First of all, the whole package of tax extenders, the individual tax cuts that we renew every year, they assume that we stop renewing them. And so there'll be this surge of revenue that'll come into the federal government every year thereafter. That's all baked into these numbers. They also assume that we're going to stick to the spending caps that I illustrated in the previous chart. And we all know, in this body, negotiations are underway right now to bust those spending caps. And the president is insisting. In fact, the president's gone so far as to say he's vetoing a national defense authorization bill, in part because we haven't yet agreed to bust the caps on non-defense spending. So despite that, these numbers assume that the caps are all complied with. And finally, Congressional Budget Office makes extremely optimistic assumptions, in my view, about economic growth going forward in the next several years. And that means they're making optimistic assumptions about how much revenue the federal government is going to be taking in. Despite that, as you can see, deficits are set to explode. And when deficits explode, the corresponding debt total goes right along with it. This is our debt. This is the gross federal debt. And the gross federal debt is exactly a function of how much we borrow every year, right? That's our annual deficit is the shortfall between revenue and spending. We make up the shortfall by going out and borrowing, and that adds to all previous years' borrowings, and the total is our debt. And look, go back to 1980, it was practically zero. Gross federal debt was a very, very modest number. Now, it's about $18 trillion and set to just continue rising. Mr. President, this is totally unsustainable. No country has been able to rack up debt on this scale and have it end well. It doesn't end well. And so, Mr. President, my point this afternoon is really a simple one. We've got a choice before us. We've got a choice before us. We're up against the debt limit. The president says, just give me more debt. Just give me more debt, and I don't even want to have a conversation about the underlying cause or about what we might do differently to solve this. And at the same time, they're saying, by the way, let's increase the rate at which we rack up this debt by busting the spending caps, by abandoning the one element of spending discipline that we've been able to achieve in this town in I don't know how many years. So I think most Republicans, I know this Republican senator, thinks that it'd be a very, very bad idea to just rack up ever more debt and do nothing at all about the underlying cause of it, to bust the spending caps without finding some offsetting way to save money in other places. By the way, when President Obama was Senator Obama, he thought it was a bad idea then too. In 2006, he said, and I quote, this was then Senator Obama, "The fact that we are here today to debate raising America's debt limit is a sign of leadership failure. Increasing America's debt weakens us domestically and internationally," end quote. 2 years later, Senator Obama in 2008 said, and I quote, "Adding $4 trillion in debt is irresponsible, it's unpatriotic," end quote. Mr. President, isn't it a little bit ironic that under President Obama, we added $8 trillion in debt, and now he wants more. He wants more, and as I say before, his insistence is that we can't even have a discussion about dealing with the underlying problems. And it's not clear to me why this president should be one of the only presidents, if not the only president, who gets a debt ceiling increase without even having a conversation about underlying reforms. In 1985, the Graham-Rudman-Hollings was a major, important budget deal that was done in the context of a debt ceiling increase. In 1990, the Budget Enforcement Act imposed some spending discipline in return for a debt ceiling increase. In 1997, we had the Balanced Budget Act, which actually achieved a balanced budget within a short period of time. That came up in the context of a debt ceiling debate. In 2011, as I mentioned at the beginning of my comments, we established spending caps because we wanted to do something about the underlying problem at the same time that we increased the debt ceiling. Unfortunately, as I've said, the administration seems unwilling to even have the discussion. Two charges that I hear from this administration that are completely untrue, and I want to dispel this. One is this notion that I hear all the time, that raising the debt limit merely enables us to pay the bills that have already been incurred. How irresponsible, they tell us, not to raise the debt limit. After all, these bills have already been incurred. That's nonsense. It's completely untrue. However many times I repeat it, doesn't make it true. I can prove it very simply. If we started running balanced budgets tomorrow and we kept running balanced budgets, we'd never need to borrow any more money. It's as simple as that. If we didn't spend any more than we took in, we wouldn't need to borrow more money. We wouldn't need to increase the debt limit. The precise reason you need to raise the debt limit is because you need to borrow more money because you intend to spend more than you're taking in. That's what the president is planning. That's what he wants to do. That's what his budget calls for. So let's not pretend that this is about, we haven't committed the spending going forward. We don't even have an appropriation bill. We don't have an omnibus. We don't have a CR. We haven't done that yet. How can it be that this is paying for bills already incurred? It's not. The second thing is that if we don't raise the debt ceiling by November 3rd, where it is implied, they don't come out and say it this way, but it's implied that we'll have this devastating, disruptive default in the markets. We won't be able to pay our Treasury debts. It's ridiculous. It's never going to happen. 90% of all the money the government's going to spend comes in the door in the form of taxes. It's the other 10% that is the shortfall that we have to go out and borrow. 90% of everything the government's going to spend comes in the form of taxes. You know how much goes out in debt service? About 7%. So for every dollar of government spending, about 7 cents is service on our debt at the moment. 90 cents comes in from taxes, and you're going to default on the debt? You'd have to intentionally, you'd have to willfully choose to do that, and I don't think even this administration would do that. So, Mr. President, I'll just conclude by saying, look, I hate the idea of raising the debt ceiling because we already have too much debt. But I understand it would be very, very difficult, not realistic, to get from where we are to a balanced budget overnight. I get that. So I would be willing to raise the debt ceiling. I think the obvious thing to do here is to tie it to some reforms, some structural reforms, even if they're just modest. I know the president's not willing to consider the kind of really architectural changes to the entitlement programs that it'll take to actually solve the problem. But could we at least make progress on the problem? Could we at least go after the low-hanging fruit? I mean, there are dozens of reforms that would at least modestly improve this fiscal imbalance, the size of these annual deficits. We could have more means testing of Medicare. In other words, very wealthy Americans could contribute more to the cost of their Medicare. We could save tens of billions of dollars a year if we did that. We could reduce some of the subsidies that go to big corporations, including big ag corporations. We spend many tens of billions of dollars a year with corporate welfare. Why don't we wipe that out? We have green energy research, which is another way of saying forcing Americans to pay for inefficient production of electricity. We spend $18 billion over the next several years on that. Medical malpractice liability reform would save the federal government $50 billion a year. Not my numbers. This is according to the Congressional Budget Office. Or maybe the size of the federal workforce. Between the Departments of Energy, Agriculture, and Commerce, we have 163,000 employees. 163,000 at the Departments of Energy, Agriculture, and Commerce. How much energy do they produce? How many crops do they grow? How much commerce do they really generate? I think we could probably do with a few less. There's hundreds of billions of dollars to be saved. We could slow down the growth of the entitlement programs for future beneficiaries. These would be reasonable things. Many of these the president at one time or another has indicated some level of support for. I'm not looking for something radical. I'm looking for just making some progress. But, Mr. President, I think it's completely unreasonable for the President to insist that he simply have the opportunity to saddle ourselves, our kids, and our grandkids with even more debt without even addressing the underlying problem that's causing us to rack up this debt in the first place. So, Mr. President, I will have more to say about this next week. I think this will not get resolved between now and then. And when it does get resolved one way or another, I hope that we will find offsets to any spending increase that we incur relative to the levels that we've agreed upon in the spending caps of the 2011 agreement. And if the debt ceiling increase occurs, I hope it will occur in the context of some improvement to the underlying situation. I yield the floor.